2, 3.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our talk this afternoon. We're going to talk about the role of the strategic volunteer. This is Kathy Scruggs, and I'll be moderating for you this afternoon. A couple of housekeeping tips. Caesar, if you can go to the next slide. We're going to be using Microsoft Teams. That means that everyone is muted. And if you have comments or questions, you can put them in the chat. You won't see that come up on your screen, but we will have someone reviewing all of those, and we'll get to those. So you don't need to enter it more than once. Don't be concerned if you don't see it. We're going to have Q&A at the end of the call, and we'll answer as many questions as we have time to address. If you have any questions or concerns, you can email me, kathy.scruggs@redcross.org. Next slide, please, Caesar. We do have closed captioning available. You can click on settings at the bottom of the screen, and the directions are there. You'll go to settings, and then you'll click captions and subtitles. You can choose Spanish or you can choose English. If you have any hearing impairments, you can change it to English, or you can have Spanish. Next slide, please. So Gerald Thomas, who is our regional executive for the North Florida region, is going to introduce our guest speaker. So Gerald, go ahead.
Thanks, Kathy. And tonight, guys, we're joined by Major General Paul Kennedy. He's going to talk a little bit about the importance of empowering our workforce to make good decisions. General Kennedy has commanded at all levels of the Marine Corps, and during his time as Commanding General of 3rd Marine Expeditionary Brigade, he led our initial response to the Philippine typhoon in 2013 and the Nepal earthquake in 2015. General Kennedy is currently the president of Lehman Kennedy Consulting. And with that, we'll turn it over to you, PK.
Next slide, Caesar.
Great. Yeah, Gerald, thank you for that. Usually people go through an introduction. It sounds like my obituary, and I'm not quite done yet. But folks, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules. I'm out in the foothills of the Blue Ridge, west of Boone, North Carolina, and so I apologize up front if my connection goes in and out. But if I drop, I'll dial back in immediately. I will try to boil any of the military jargon out of what I say this afternoon. If something that I say is unclear, please do not hesitate to flag it and ask me to decipher what I just said. I don't mind. And Kathy, I'm not sure if you want to take questions in the middle of what my initial presentation, but if nobody stops me, I'm just going to continue to speak.
That sounds good.
So from the perspective of those natural disasters that Gerald gave me credit for, I saw there's a lot of parallels between first responders, international humanitarian organizations, or in your case, domestic humanitarian organizations, and what the military does. And even though the structures are a little bit different and it's not quite as hierarchical, I saw that there were a lot of the same challenges that we experienced in the military coming out of the Cold War in the 80s. And so when I was a youngster, we had a problem with, during the Cold War with breaking out of the paradigm of how our fathers had fought in World War II. And what we knew the future war was going to be like would be a very chaotic form of conflict where the rules of World War II and maybe Korea did not apply. And what it was going to require was greater emphasis on a lower ranking person to be involved in the decision making and taking action, just by the nature of the battlefield. And so what we saw was rather than having two front lines facing each other, and so you knew where the bad guys were and you knew where the friendly and the good guys were, this was going to be kind of a non-contiguous battlefield in the future, where you would have pockets of real high intensity crisis occurring adjacent to relatively low intensity pockets where maybe they were in a recovery phase. And next to them was a third pocket, which represented perhaps a future crisis, something that was in the making that you might, with rapidity of action, be able to nip in the bud before it reached the crisis stage. And so those three realities were all competing within an adjacent space. That's what we saw in the military. And what I saw, that was very similar to what the first responders were experiencing when we were conducting those natural disasters. And so what we decided during the late 80s and in the 90s was those three levels of crisis were going to have to be addressed by a very junior person that we called a strategic corporal. And a strategic corporal was going to have to be savvy enough to make decisions that had been reserved for much higher ranks in previous conflicts. And that person, he or she, would be required to make decisions and take actions that could have farther reaching ramifications than their immediate locale. And I will tell you that in the military, commanders took it two ways. Either that strategic corporal was an asset and that you could rely upon he or she to take action when, even without communication, they based on initiative and their read of the situation, or the strategic corporal would be viewed as a liability, where if they made a wrong decision, it would have ripples all the way up the chain of command. I've always been of a mind that those people are assets. That if you invest the time and effort up front before the crisis, before they have to make that critical decision, then you can count on the quality of the decision that they're going to make, because it should be a reflection of your investment. And so, like, it's really, there really wasn't any other option. And that is the nature of conflict today. And I imagine that your volunteers are experiencing a similar environment where crisis is coming at them fast. They may have imperfect communications with their higher echelon. They have to take action on the spot, and we're going to have to live with the actions that they took. And you can either assure yourself that it is going to be a positive result, or if you hadn't invested on the front end in their training and in their ability to communicate with you, it'll be a bad result. And so what we see that is the decentralization of authority is what we call flattening. And so an organization that is typically hierarchical in nature, where there are basically echelons of command. There's the most senior command, and there might be 3, 4, or 5 echelons till you get to the point of contact where the people that are actually carrying out the mission are making decisions. And in the old days, when I was a younger person, you had to ask permission at every level to take action, all the way up to the top, and then the decision that would come back down, whether it was timely or not, it was what you waited on. Today, what we're asking for is trust that those subordinates will take action with the interests of the higher organization in mind, that they're coordinated, that they're nested inside the larger operation, and that the seniors will trust that they will take those actions and coordinate that initiative at the soonest possibility. And I'll elaborate on that. What I would tell you, though, the flip side of that coin is when you flatten your organization, you increase your span of control at the top. And so when you start cutting out intermediate managers and headquarters, and now in this flat model, you're basically having direct communications with that lowest echelon, that you run the risk of exceeding your ability to give them high fidelity, meaningful orders. Because where you might have only dealt with 3 or 4 subordinates, 5 subordinates in the past. Now you're talking about you might be giving orders to 20 people, and each of them requires the same careful thought and consideration, and that is a problem. And I think that if you choose to go with a flat model, that you have a moral responsibility to ensure that most junior echelon's success prior to the crisis. So what I wanted to do is talk about, I think, I assume I'm speaking to leaders on this call, what you have to understand is sort of the nature of your organization and how you execute what we call in the military command and control. Or of course, we shorten it to just C2. And so command and control is really, in a non-military parlance, it's authority. Command is your authority and your organizational structure, whether you're hierarchical or flat. Control is basically how you carry out decision-making, whether it is, again, time-consuming, vertically integrated, vertically stacked, or it is collaborative, intuitive, and fast. And so if you don't have an understanding about how you control, and they're both legitimate models, a centralized and a decentralized model, you have to be honest with yourself of if you are capable of executing in a decentralized fashion. And what I would tell you as leaders is that you ought to actually go through your process and understand how you deal with inputs to a problem and then what your outputs are. And I liken it to a supply and demand graph, where demand and supply intersect, and you're supposed to reach an equilibrium between your inputs and your outputs. Your inputs are how you assess the crisis. What are the conditions? What are the assets that I have available? What are my time constraints? What is the expectation from my higher authority? And those demands on that graph are based upon, if you have an X and a Y axis, the factors of risk versus time, where risk is a cost and time is a commodity. And in a crisis, you always want more time to make a decision, more time to prep yourself, and more time to execute in a really controlled, deliberate fashion. But the problem is it costs a lot. And while you're getting very, you think you have a great plan and you're carrying it out very deliberately, other factors are spinning faster than your actions, and you wind up being irrelevant. And so I would ask you to look at those two, the intersection of inputs and outputs. Your outputs are your processes of decision making, communicating the decision into tasking, and then how you execute in that task. And if you don't have equilibrium to where the risk is high, your assessment is very high, that there's great risk involved, but your process is really slow, your output is really slow, then you run the risk of being irrelevant, as I stated previously. And I'll pause if anybody wants to ask a question about that. Okay.
We don't have any questions in the queue right now, so thank you.
Okay. Well, hopefully I haven't just put everybody to sleep, but I'm going to talk about what your requirements are as leaders before we get to what your actual expectation is of a strategic volunteer. And so I think it's incumbent upon your leadership, if you've made that assessment of how you react in a crisis, it's incumbent upon the leader to decentralize. If you want to reach decentralization, I would suggest you centralize to what we call in the military to the left of boom. And boom is the event. Boom is the crisis. So everything you do prior to that, you ought to do in a centralized, very methodical manner. You ought to have iterative training events. You ought to have conversations like you're having tonight. You ought to have open lines of communication from those junior leaders to try to understand the decision-making process of the most senior person. And if you invest on the front side in a centralized fashion of training and education before the crisis, then when you execute during the crisis, you should be able to do so with assurance that they have been trained to think like their leader. It's not easy to do that. And in the military, where we are very hierarchical, customs and traditions sort of prevent that clear communication between the most senior members of the organization and the junior members. I talked about this to some of your colleagues a couple of weeks ago, but I commanded a battalion of Marines, which is about 1,000 people, before we went to Iraq. And knowing that the conditions in Iraq would be similar to what I had described, very chaotic on the high end and the low end, happening simultaneously, I decided to make an investment not in the next level of leaders, but in the lowest level of leaders, which are called squad leaders. And a squad is about 13 to 15 people. And what I did was I called those squad leaders, there's about 30 of them that comprise a battalion of Marines. I called them, and it was an all-male organization, so I called them the Men of Action. And what I did was when you walked into the headquarters, I took down the pictures of all the previous commanders. And I like to say to audiences that, you know, it was just like a pantheon of old dead white guys that stretched back to like World War I. And nobody knew who they were, and they really had no impact on what we were about to embark upon. And I replaced those old pictures with the pictures of these young squad leaders who were relevant to the lives of the even more junior Marines. And I put a big banner over the top of, these are the Men of Action. And I caught a lot of flack for doing that and sort of raising up this lowest echelon of leaders. I think people thought I was like a socialist or a communist or something, but I thought that if I was able to make them feel like they were charter members of the organization, that they were included in the decision making, and that their input counted, that I could count upon them when we got to Iraq several months later to make decisions with the larger organization's welfare in mind. And it was hard when we would get together and we would have weekly training meetings where previously you'd have all the, you know, your C-suite, so to speak, your next level of executives in the front row, and then the most junior people in the back row. And I inverted that. And I put the people that would actually be carrying out the missions in the front row, so it would be clear as to how I was thinking about tactics. And then they could ask me directly if it was unclear what I was thinking in a tactical decision problem. And I'm telling you, that investment left of boom on the timeline, left of us actually going into combat, paid off huge dividends for me. I see if you're going to flatten an organization, you're going to decentralize your organization and create strategic volunteers, that you basically are creating a contract between the leaders and those that are led. And the leader contracts, the leader agrees to expecting mistakes from subordinates, especially in training, where those mistakes don't cost anything. That you don't cut their heads off. There is no zero defects mentality, that they're younger, they're less experienced, they don't have a staff, that they're going to make some mistakes. And as long as they're not repeated, and that those mistakes were not the result of fear or uncertainty or laziness or some other selfish thing, then you allow that. You should expect that. And then you have to operate with that in mind. Beyond that, the subordinate in that agreement contracts to take ownership of the task that he or she has been assigned and the people that fall under them, and that they will act. And remember, action is the key. that they will act based on initiative and or opportunity that is presented to them. And then in executing with that initiative, they then coordinate that as soon as possible with their higher headquarters, just so everybody knows that something had changed and they had to act with initiative to be relevant to that change. You then have to coordinate that with your adjacent units and with your higher headquarters. And the result in that sort of a relationship between leader and led is that you get greater buy-in from your subordinates. They feel like their opinions matter, that their welfare is being taken into consideration, and that there has to be some reward system on the back end for them having executed with initiative. We have a little saying in the Marine Corps that the essential thing is action. And that action has 3 stages. The first is a decision born of thought, actually a considered decision. The second is the order that derives from that decision and your preparation for execution. And then the third is the execution itself. And all 3 of those actions are carried out on a timeline. And if you've got, whether it's 3 hours or 3 days or 3 months, it's going to all involve those 3 steps. And if you eat up all of your time as a leader in the decision-making phase, then you leave yourself no time for the preparation execution phase. And that's a sin. Likewise, if the leader eats up all the time in making the decision, you give your subordinates no time to write their own plan and issue the order and prepare for action. And so we have a rule in the Marine Corps called the third rules. And the third rule is that the leader only takes 1/3 of the time allotted to carry out the decision-making stage of what I described. And that gives your subordinate echelons 2/3 the time, and they're going to break it up into thirds as well for their subordinates. And so if you can live by that, and I really have rarely seen people do that well, then what you have is a collaborative approach to how you prepare for action in the face of crisis. We say that all 3 of those stages are governed by your will. And that will is rooted in character. And when I'm talking about character is not virtue, although it is virtuous. Character is the ability to take action in the face of adversity. That's how we define character. Or it could be defined as taking the road less traveled. Be willing to walk the road alone. And if you're the person that can take action in the face of a crisis at 2 o'clock in the morning, somebody shakes you awake, it's cold, it's raining, you might be in combat, you might be in a hurricane, and you can take action, then that is the basis of character. And for the person of action, character is more important than your intellect even. And we say that intellect without character is worthless, and conversely, character without intellect is dangerous. And so I would encourage folks to sort of have those discussions about what do you value, what character traits do you value in yourself and in your subordinates, and how do you cultivate those things so they're biased towards action. And that's another term that we use in the military, that when in doubt, you're going to take action. Kathy, my last thoughts on how you grow strategic volunteers or strategic corporals in our cases is that those individuals, if the expectation is that they are supposed to take action with the higher organization's purpose in mind, then they have to think 2 levels up. And your orders to them need to be 2 levels down. And so you need to think about how they're going to direct their own subordinates. And so that sort of fidelity of what the expectation is from high to low needs to be considered. So we use the level of 2 rule. The strategic volunteer needs to be able to seek opportunities to further the cause of the organization. And so prior to going to the Philippine Typhoon, I was given the I was given the privilege of being the public affairs director for the entire Marine Corps. And that meant that I dealt with the media. I had a presence on social media. I was in charge of advertising. I was in charge of public events where we reached out to the public. So I was very aware of the sort of the brand image of my organization. Several months later, I go out to Asia and this disaster occurs. And I thought it was incumbent upon myself, and I was the strategic corporal in that role, that I was going to engage with people to talk about what my organization did. And I did interviews with pretty much with anybody who asked. And I think that you ought to train your subordinates to be comfortable in engaging with the media at the level where they are competent. So they shouldn't be talking about what the whole organization is doing. They should be talking as experts about what they are doing. And you, as leaders, ought to be comfortable with them taking the opportunity with those engagements. And what you'll do is you will make sure that people understand what the American Red Cross is doing for the country, both for the taxpayers and for your donors in carrying out, your role in these disasters. And so what I saw with USAID and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance during the typhoon and the earthquake was a reluctance to trust the most junior leaders with engaging with the media. And as a matter of fact, all of the media engagements were funneled up to the head of the organization. And to be honest with you, that person's the granularity of what he or she understood about what's taking place on the ground was pretty thin. And so I would encourage you to make your most junior people very savvy in how you deal with the media. The strategic volunteer also needs to recruit allies as you're in the midst of this crisis. And I think your allies are first responders and other agencies that carry out disaster relief. And if it's all about just the Red Cross, then what you wind up doing is creating competition and animosity. And as far as I was concerned in my role, I never sought credit for what I was doing. I was glad to give it to another organization, but I needed their help in what I was trying to do. We were a community of interest. And so sometimes it's hard. You really create an us versus them, but I would encourage your volunteers to seek out and recruit allies in what you all are doing. And then the last thing I would say is, and I sort of touched upon it, but we use the term a distant aim point. And so the leader can give the direct subordinate a task that is relevant in time and place. That task might be overcome by events and quickly be irrelevant, but as long as that person, that subordinate, understands the ultimate goal of what you're trying to achieve, that's the distant aiming point, that they can take action based on initiative and opportunity to further your achievement of that goal, if that makes sense. Otherwise, what you get is their mission is no longer relevant and they stop. And they miss those opportunities. They may be fleeting opportunities, and that's another cardinal sin. So, Gerald and Kathy, that is basically a thumbnail sketch of how we thought decentralizing the Marine Corps and making relevant little dynamos of action to be carried out was how we would win our future conflicts. And so, I hope that wasn't a waste of your time, but that's how the Marine Corps' perspective on this problem is. And I'm willing to field questions at this point.
So thank you very much, sir. I mean, that was incredible. I appreciate all you talked about. This is Virginia Mewborn, and I will be moderating the questions. And we only have a couple. One's a comment, one's a question. And the first one, I think you could really do a nice job with this. Can you discuss how we build trust between leaders and the led?
Well, I mean, I assume most folks on the call are parents. Maybe that's a bad assumption, but your subordinates, like my kids, are going to make mistakes. And if you chop their heads off the first time they try something, then they're never going to try it again. And to me, trust is probably the single most important virtue in an organization that responds to crisis, because you all are going into harm's way, and you have to be able to count on your people to the left and to the right, and to the people that govern you. So I would tell you that best not to practice this during the crisis, but try to, in your training and in your conversations and in the preparations that you do prior to the event, to the left of boom, that you give them the widest possible leeway in making decisions. And what I found was we would do a lot of problem solving prior to going into combat. And we'd sit there and we'd throw up, like a war game up, and I would offer my solution last. And I would ask my junior people to say, how would you do this? And there was no wrong answer as long as it was feasible. And then at the end, they'd say, sir, how would you have done it? And then I would talk about why I would do it, maybe differently. And that way they understood what I was doing. And when they were getting up there to volunteer their solution, I never made them feel like fools for offering. And so that was another method of how we established trust. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. So we have a couple more comments. So when you talked about 2-up, each troop, someone said that's an asset of American forces. Each troop is capable of moving to the next one or two positions in the event the leader is down. So just a comment about what you were talking about earlier. And then someone else said, sure.
Can I elaborate on that for a second?
Please do.
I've always told my next level of subordinates, and this is all the way up until I was, being a general officer, that you as, my next subordinate, you have got to train your subordinates to put you out of a job. That they should be trained to be able to do your job. So in the off chance, hopefully, it never happens, that you are either taken out of the equation by injury or by whatever event, that they're ready to step up. You cannot expect them to be trained to jump into that position if they haven't thought about it prior to the event.
Thank you very, very much. So I got a hard one for you. How do you keep the volunteer from feeling that she is doing the leader's work and the leader is doing nothing but sitting around?
Very, 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 that's a great question. So we call it, because again, we're talking about combat, we call it battlefield circulation. And battlefield circulation is where the most senior leaders are actually getting up to the front lines. And they're sharing in the hardship and the danger. And you're not going up there, in a gilded coach or in a bubble, that you're up there, you're asking their opinion. Again, so they have buy-in, and they may actually give you details that would never filter up to you through the other echelons. So you spend all of your time going down to those levels. And what you do is, you learn people's names and they feel like you care about them. The risk is that you spend so much time doing that you lose the larger picture. And so you have to strike a balance between how much of the time is you sitting back, as you said, in your headquarters, because you have people that you have to respond to as well. You're more senior leadership. So you have to divide that time. And I say that I probably defaulted to more time down on the lower end. And especially as I got more comfortable in a combat situation, I knew that my staff could take care of business back at the headquarters. And oftentimes they would be getting the wrong picture, and I would be able to return from the front lines and tell them, no, that's not what's going on. This is what is going on. And you could correct something before it got, out of control. And so I would tell you, shared adversity, being on the front line matters for leaders.
Great, thank you so much. So the next one is, thank you for your time and information this evening. You mentioned promoting initiative, taking action, and highlighted the benefit of building volunteers who could take action when needed, even if it meant a change to the overall plan. How do you, as a leader, approach evaluating that action and responding to the change?
To make sure that if that subordinate element took action that was in the best interest of your overall organization? Is that sort of what they're asking?
Yes, I believe so.
I think that one, I mean, you should establish measures of effectiveness. Before you go into these crises, you ought to have like a playbook that tells you, as this thing progresses and we hit these marks, are we on the right track? And so you'll know that if one of these subordinate echelons that you're trusting to take action is doing something that is against that measurable goal, it's an intermediate goal. You as long as you're informed early enough, you can take action to either mitigate if that was a bad decision, or even if it was a good decision, but something else occurred, a reaction occurred. As long as there's clear communications, you can react. And that's why I was saying earlier that in this contract between leader and led, if the junior person is going to take action, it is something other than what you expected. It was because of an opportunity or because the situation had changed, that they have an obligation to inform you as soon as is practicable. And sometimes when you don't have, good communication, like electronic communication, that's difficult. But they have an obligation to tell you how they changed their mission. And because without that, you might be going off in a different direction, thinking that they did what you told them to do, and instead they took appropriate action based on how they read it. And if they don't coordinate it, you'll get all discombobulated. And so I think that if you maintain that positive communication, supplemented with the leader going down to get an assessment from those junior levels, then you have a good means of judging whether your plan is on track or if you need to make a new decision.
Great. Thank you so much. So I got another one for you, sir. Any advice to lower level managers about getting field feedback back up the chain of command, even if the feedback is from another line of service?
And when you say another line of service, you mean like a...
So I work in disaster services. So if I'm getting feedback from the field and the feedback is in volunteer services, so another area that Red Cross serves, or another department.
So I would tell you, Virginia, it is impossible for you to achieve high tempo operations if you do not rely upon horizontal communication between organizations. And so if you discourage your people from talking to somebody in another organization or another department, then I think that you're going to miss those opportunities to take action. And what you basically are doing is you create silos or stovepipes of, within your organization, and and your adjacent unit is going to do the same thing, and you may be working at cross purposes, or you may be going in different directions. And so I would actively encourage your lower levels to reach out to people that are adjacent to them for information. Otherwise, again, you may miss either a large threat that is building, or you may miss an opportunity to nip something in the bud. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. And I think that's something that, we struggle, and I think across the board, that's a common struggle. So we have a comment from someone who is a veteran, and they say, as a veteran, I found leading in the Red Cross is like leading militia troops, really good, but not quite as disciplined. Any thoughts on leading in a more casual workforce?
Well, I think that this decentralized approach lends itself to that sort of a reality. The Marine Corps is sort of regimented. Believe it or not, out in our operations, we're pretty loose with how we carry things out. The Army is amazed at how we function. So like we've got these, stupid haircuts and uniforms, and everybody, sees us marching around, in peacetime. But when we're in a crisis, it's very, very, it's much more like jazz than it is an orchestra. And so if you understand that is the nature of your organization, don't expect it to be like, like the drill field. And again, I think in a militia, that's a great term, by the way, whoever said that. And I've worked with the International Red Cross. I've worked with World Food and UN OCHA, USAID, like all the charities that are over internationally, and they don't look like the military, and they don't take orders from an old man like me. And I'm talking to somebody with a beard and wearing sandals. You have to make the adjustment. Your organization has to make the adjustment. Don't expect them to adjust to you. I think that would be my advice. And that if you show respect to people, they will generally want to comply. They will collaborate with you, even if they are a militia instead of, a highly disciplined special operations group. Does that answer that question?
It does. And Steve was in the Army, and so he appreciates your comments. So
in Virginia, can I tell Steve, if you want to use that as a model, the Army is better than the Marine Corps in planning, in really deliberate preparation. They've got great regulations and policies. I mean, it's a world-class organization. But I've worked for the Army in combat. When I was in Iraq, I actually reported to the Army. Because of that regimented system, you miss opportunities that we're talking about to create tempo and speed by relying on the most junior leaders. And the equivalence in our organization to their counterparts in the Army is a full rank lower. So a squad leader in my organization is a junior sergeant. In the Army is a full rank and many years senior. And so people wonder, the Marine Corps is more like a militia in many respects. And you got to be comfortable with that. That's the reality of the people that you're going to have to lead.
great, thank you. So we have another comment and a question. Love this model of leadership. Just curious, the leadership in between the squad leaders and the higher echelon, is their role to support, carry out mission?
Yeah, that's great. So you're asking, is the senior's role to support the person that is in contact?
Yes, sir.
I'm paraphrasing.
Yes, sir.
So yeah, so I worked for General Mattis during the unfortunate invasion of Iraq, and I was his planner. I drew a lot of cues from his leadership style, and his view of leadership was you should always be giving something to your subordinates, not taking away. And that if you're going to visit them, they should feel better for that interaction rather than feeling like they got chewed out. And so I took that a step further with my folks. And my advice to my immediate subordinates was you ought to be passing a loaded magazine forward, almost like the way in a relay race, the baton, the person that's about to take on the race just reaches back and expect something to be put in their hand. That's the way you ought to view it. So if they're begging for supplies, they're begging for support, they're begging for something from their higher echelons, then something has broken down.
Thank you very much. So any closing comments for you, General?
Well, I would tell you that I absolutely admire what your organization does. I think that the military has been in the spotlight for the last 20 years, and we really appreciate it. The country has reached out, and they when you're walking through the airport, and they see your haircut, your uniform, they say thank you for your service, and I would turn that around to you. Domestic responders and those that do international humanitarian response are doing it oftentimes with a lot fewer resources, and they get a lot less credit for what they do. And so I would just tell you, your leadership teams and your volunteers, thank you for your service. And what the American taxpayers and your donor base ought to feel as though your rapid response and your sacrifices that you make are the return on their investment, and they ought to feel pretty darn good about that investment. It's a sound investment. And so if I can ever be an ally to your organization, or if anybody that is on this call would like to contact me through my email, I believe that you have that. I'm willing to elaborate on what we've talked about, and maybe some strategies about how you might create these high tempo flat organizations. And I rest.
Well, sir, on behalf of everyone on this call, we thank you very much and appreciate your candor with us, being so candid with us. I want to throw it to Gerald for closing comments.
Thanks, VA. And Gerald, thank you so much for spending the time with us and taking a little time away from your much needed vacation or a little time off. We very much appreciate it. We will definitely, have you back and look to maybe have some smaller conversations and small groups, because I've gotten a few text messages and I know folks would really love to continue these conversations.
Well, Gerald, thanks for that. I tell this, folks, I'm a humanitarian too, even though, we oftentimes carry guns, and, it looks like we're on the pointy end of things. The military are your allies, whether it's domestic or international response. So thanks for having me back on.
Righty. Thanks everyone for joining. We very much appreciate you taking the time to do that. Remember to wash your hands, wear your mask, and stay 6 feet away from other human beings. And with that, Kathy, I'll pass it back over to you.
All right, Gerald. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, General Kennedy, for your comments. We really appreciate your presentation today, and this concludes our presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kathy. Bye-bye.